with technology, it'll throw up some thorny questions for select committees going forward. AI, potentially writing quite convincing submissions on behalf of people who don't exist. How are committees going to be able to deal with some of that coordinated inauthentic or less authentic behavior is the sort of technical term. I don't think it's something that's fully come to reality quite yet, but it's something to kind of be aware of because it probably will play a role in how the politics works going forward.
Hello and welcome to Raw Politics, Newsroom's weekly podcast and video chat on the big political issues. I'm Newsroom political editor Laura Walters, and with me in Wellington is Marc Daalder.
Hello. And
we're patching in our Christchurch studio for the first time. Joining us from the mainland is Sam Suchdeva.
Hello team, how are we?
Great. How are we doing down there?
Oh good, can't complain. Everything's fine on the mainland.
Perfect. Today on Raw Politics, we will discuss the return of Strike Force Raptor and Shane Jones' secret dinners with mining companies. And then to wrap up, we'll be offering you some recommendations. When Simon Bridges first announced a National Party policy of a special gang unit modelled on New South Wales' Strike Force Raptor, it wasn't really taken seriously, and there was expert testimony saying the approach wouldn't work. Well, it's back in all but the name after Police Commissioner Andrew Coster and Police Minister Mark Mitchell announced the creation of a new gang unit on Wednesday. For those of you who haven't caught up on the news of not Strike Force Raptor, basically what it is a new central gang unit with kind of 25 to 30 specialists and then some district teams that are stationed around the country with around about 7 people in each. There'll be intelligence gathering and a focus on disrupting gang activity and stopping organised crime before it gets out of hand. So I remember covering Strike Force Raptor back under Simon Bridges, and it wasn't really taken seriously at the time, but this time around it seems to be a little bit different because the government is obviously the government this time, not the opposition. They're pushing through a whole lot of new gang legislation, and I guess this is really the resourcing response. This is the resource, the cops, the money that's going to back that up and I guess follow through with these promises from the government on the crackdown on gangs, going hard on law and order. Whether or not it will actually work is a different question altogether. And I'm interested in what both of you kind of think about that and whether it might get, a different response this time, whether it might be more effective than what we saw in New South Wales, for example.
One question that you kind of have to ask with many law and order policies is the goal to actually do what it says on the tin, or is it just to satisfy voters who are concerned about law and order? And on the latter, I think people will probably receive it well. For most New Zealanders, there's not a lot of social license for gangs, and so anything going after them is generally seen as perfectly warranted. Whether it works or not, though, it does seem like the expert views are more in the not direction. Sam?
Yeah, it might seem silly, but I think perceptions of safety are almost as important as actual safety, right? Not entirely, but, if people feel like something is being done, then that probably helps to sort of, tamp down their concerns. So, in terms of the psychological component, yeah, look, maybe it'll help a bit. I think at a practical level, there are issues and questions that have already been asked around resourcing and funding. I think Chris Cahill at the Police Association has seized on that, saying, look, this is great, we've got a dedicated unit, is there going to be dedicated funding, or is this going to have to be done within baseline? And I think the answer seems to be, a mix of both, that we might see some new funding in the budget, but also it is going to have to be done with existing resources to a degree. And if that's the case, then obviously you have to wonder, how does that affect the other work that police do? Because, you can't have them doing more and more and more with the same amount of resources. So, there's that very sort of logistical element that I think is going to have to be navigated by police and the government.
Yeah, and you mentioned the budget, Sam. There are obviously some holes in this announcement, which it must be frustrating to come out and announce a big kind of policy or a big operational announcement like this and then not be able to announce how much money is going into it, exactly how many officers are going into it, exactly where they're going to be. And some of that will need to be worked through, and there must need to be some flexibility depending on where they're seeing the gang problem pop up. But it will be telling, whatever we see in the budget, like you say, whether there's actually the money, the resources behind it, and whether they can recruit enough police as well. It's one thing for the government to promise that they're going to add additional officers, maybe specialist officers and frontline officers to go after the gangs. But if you can't recruit the people over and above, the attrition rate or the rate of people leaving, then, those promises don't really count for much. And I think it's really worth noting as well, while there's a lot of discussion and things are out going hard on gangs, which I think needs to be done. I mean, in the past, I think it's 7 years, the number of gang members has almost doubled if you go by, the police figures. So we do have a real problem out there. But whether you're dealing with kind of the symptoms of harm done by gang or the underlying drivers of what is driving people into gangs, those are two very different things. And it seems that this government so far has kind of been focusing on the former, whether they're going to be focusing on that other part, those drivers of crime, what's driving people to join gangs, how do we support them with kind of, social support, wraparound services? Do we keep pilots running for things like getting people, supporting people out of meth addiction and stuff like that in communities that are really facing those problems? I think that's going to be interesting to see if there's that, that parallel approach, or whether it's just, hit them hard, let the police go hard on gangs, lock them all up, kind of throw away the key mentality, which, might win votes but doesn't actually get to the core of the problem or the root of the problem there.
I'll just jump in to say that if I was Mark Mitchell, a different Mark, I wouldn't be too fussed about not being able to give all the specific figures, because after last week's postcab sort of performance, being able to defer to May 30 and the finance minister seems convenient when you don't have to, cite a specific number or explain how you arrived at it.
Mm-hmm. This was a slightly more seamless announcement, I think. Maybe it helped having the police commissioner there across those operational details as well.
As an aside, I mean, how striking is it the transformation of Cuddles Costa to Crusher Costa? Although, Judith Collins might claim that nickname's already taken. But, this was the police chief who was the subject of, quite stinging criticism from the national opposition in the last sort of 2 terms of Parliament. And now he's in the fold. He's leading these gang reforms. And look, that's part of the job, right? That's what you do. You serve the government of the day and you cater to their priorities. But I just find that striking, that it shows how quickly, departmental chief executives, or in this case, a police commissioner, have to sort of turn around on the way they tackle these sorts of issues.
Absolutely. It's kind of get on board or get out, basically.
If Crusher's taken, can I offer, in the vein of Strike Force Raptor, Cretaceous Coster?
might need some work, Mark.
That's okay.
I see the potential.
We'll work on the dinosaur jokes.
I think we can get some consultants in, or police can, to figure out the branding.
Shane Jones has been in the headlines again this week, which isn't all that surprising. This time, it's for his undeclared dinners with mining company executives who he encouraged to apply for fast-track consents, as Newsroom's David Williams has reported. Mark, you've been following this. What's the story?
Yeah, Dave has a great scoop here about Shane Jones down on the West Coast earlier this year, being approached by a mining company executive who said, want to come out for dinner with me and my mates. And during the course of that dinner, Shane Jones evidently referred him to Chris Bishop to inquire about how he might get a fast-track consent. That letter to Chris Bishop was obtained by Dave, and kind of it all spilled out after that. Shane Jones didn't put this dinner on his diary, his list of meetings with various people, which isn't all that unusual because it was sort of an ad hoc thing. If it's not scheduled, it often doesn't appear on that diary. But it kind of does get to the questions that we've got around the fast-track process, or some of the questions around conflicts of interest, because, as you'll have heard us say last year, the perception of conflict of interest is often just as serious as, whether there really is one or isn't one. And so that sort of thing you'd want to be disclosed given that issue. Sam, as a long-time Jones watcher, which is much less exciting than bird watching, I should say, should we be surprised by this sort of behavior?
Look, I think the thing with Shane Jones watching and bird watching is there's probably similar amounts of preening and primping and displaying of feathers. So this is just, this is who Matua Shane, as he likes to refer to himself, is. He is someone who is very close with the industry and prides himself on that. He had quite a striking line when he responded today, which I want to read out because I think it speaks to who he is. It's still legal in New Zealand for industry to engage in pester politicians, and I may prove to be one of the most pesterable politicians. So he's saying, this is who I am. I pride myself on this. This is not a bug. It's a feature. It's part of who he is. And, he also seems to delight in winding up the Green Party and the environmentalists on the elements of the fast track bill that might relate to the environment. You have government ministers in the House taking questions and saying, no, we're going to have environmental safeguards. Don't worry, everything will be sorted. And then in the background, you hear this sort of drone from him, which is just coal. He just he likes sort of poking the bear a little bit. So. And that's part of the problem, right? If you look at this in isolation, that's probably on the lower end of the sort of scale of seriousness. He's attributed it to it being an oversight by his office that it didn't go in the diary. He's referred the mining company on to Chris Bishop, which is the way things are being done. And Chris Bishop has basically said, look, I just gave them the pro forma letter that's gone to every group with an interest saying, here's the process, here's what you need to do. But it just feeds into those preconceptions about Shane Jones and how he operates. And that's going to be the issue throughout this fast track process, really. And I guess that's one of the problems with having it in the hands of ministers, and I'm sure you can talk about this, Mark, is that, to have Shane Jones as one of those three with his track record and his unique approach, I think creates difficulties.
Yeah, and I think with the fast track process in particular, it is that concentration of the decision-making ability in the hands of three ministers, which is, part of the problem here. We've got a fast track process already, which was passed as part of the COVID recovery bill in 2020. What that process involves is an expert panel that involves sort of, environment advocates and experts reviewing these consents. Ministers can pass them on, but it's this panel that makes the final decision. The new process has ministers making the final decision. The panel just looks at them and says, we think you should give this consent. We think you shouldn't. Here are some conditions you should put on if you do. But the final choice is up to the ministers. And when you've got that individual, three people, one of them being Shane Jones, making that decision, and then you have all these layers of donations and access and now potentially policy outcomes stacked on top of each other, it makes it so much harder to go, this is just a perception. Because it may just be a perception. But by making the process so individual and putting yourself at the center of it, you're inviting those sorts of questions and queries.
Mm-hmm. And there has been huge backlash because of all of these things that we've been discussing. But now we've seen that some ministers, Chris Bishop, initially have been hinting at backtracks on the fast track. What's that about, Mark?
Yeah, I think the backlash has been greater than they expected. RMA reform, not usually an area likely to incite the passions of the public, partly due to the complexity, but the simplicity of the fast track process and the effectiveness with which the government has communicated it's a fast track, it's a one-stop shop, we're getting rid of all this red tape. That, very effective communication, and for a particular section of their base, they're loving it. But for potentially a wider swathe of New Zealanders who are looking at it and going, actually, kind of like the Conservation Act, kind of like the Wildlife Act. I feel like they sound important to me in terms of,
like frogs.
Yeah, frogs, or at least the one frog in particular.
Freddie. Poor old Freddie.
Poor old Freddie. I don't want to see Shane Jones step on a kiwi bird. Like, all of these things have led to this large public backlash, not just the environmental NGOs, but quite a sort of grassroots movement, and iwi. I did an article a couple weeks ago speaking to Ngāti Toa, which of iwi in New Zealand, probably have among the greatest development interests. They've got, huge amounts of housing that they're trying to build out in Porirua and infrastructure that needs to go in alongside that. They want streamlined consents, but what they don't want is environmental degradation, and they say, you can do both, and they feel the government has gone too far in that one direction. Mm-hmm. So we've seen Chris Bishop make some noises about maybe taking that decision-making power off ministers. Shane Jones also last week seemed open to that. He was very low energy on that day, which was interesting. I'm pulling my American heritage here and using some Trumpian terms, but low energy Shane, both in the House and on Bridge Run, speaking to journalists, very contrite, very open to constructive feedback on the fast track bill.
Not very Shane Jones.
Not very Shane Jones at all. And compared to how both Chris Bishop and Shane Jones pitched this, say, in February and March, which was, we have a mandate, we're going to do this, we ran on this, we're going to do this, and basically sit down and be quiet. It's a very different tone coming out of the government. Doesn't mean that all the changes will necessarily tick everyone's boxes, but it's clear that the politics of this have become more difficult than the government expected.
On a similar note, this week's audience question is from Tessa, and they ask, regarding the fast-track legislation, is it democratic for the government to stop people from speaking to their fast-track submission, even if they want to? Mark, what do you reckon?
Yeah, the context for this question is that there have been 27,000 submissions in the fast track bill, and a significant number of those people ticked the box saying, I want to present my submission and speak to it to the select committee that's considering the bill. The difficulty being the select committee process is 6 months long, but still not enough time given the many thousands of people who would like to appear before it. And so the committee has basically said, we're going to have to randomly pick of those people who've indicated preference who is going to be able to do this, and some people won't be able to. Mm. Is it democratic? I think it highlights an issue with, the accessibility of the New Zealand sort of political system running into, A, just population growth over time, B, more widespread involvement of everyday people in politics, which is a good thing that we want to see, and see some of the ways in which technology can facilitate mass submissions, form submissions. So a lot of those submissions that have been received will be from Forest and Bird, who had a form submission, and that's not uncommon. You see that on plenty of other legislation as well. So I don't know that the question is best answered as to whether it's democratic or not, but I think it's an interesting opportunity for us to reflect on how these submitting processes work, because it has been a problem that's been growing in recent years.
Yeah. There's precedent for this. I remember the end of life choice bill. David Seymour's assisted dying or euthanasia bill had something like 40,000 submissions, and they had to do a similar thing. They had to break into groups. They had to travel around the country. In the end, I think they heard from about 1,400 people. It's just not possible to hear from 40,000 people. Of course, not everyone wants to be heard. Not everyone wants to speak directly to the committee. They just want to send their letter. And then when I think it was the Ministry of Justice did hate speech legislation, and they had a discussion document out. They had something like 19,000 submissions as well. So, like you say, people are becoming more involved. But then it becomes a question as well of who do you choose? Who do you choose? Who comes and speaks in front of you? How do you decide how that's weighted? And with modern technology as well, with people being able to do that via, Zoom or video link, surely it becomes easier. Should you be hearing from more people? Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on it, Sam?
Yeah, I was interested to hear that esteemed journalist Richard Harman of Politic actually made an argument to the contrary earlier this week, which was that, is the Select Committee hearing too many submissions? And thank you to friend of the podcast, Graham Edgeler, for drawing our attention to that. But it's an interesting one to look at it that way, because, the point of the Select Committee is to deliberate over the legislation, yes, to obviously hear from the public, but to take the time to figure out what amendments need to be made and how it can be better drafted so it comes out as the best law it can possibly be. And obviously, the more time you spend hearing from people who are not always going to make identical points, but certainly very similar ones, I would suspect in a lot of cases, the more backloaded and probably rushed that sort of deliberation process gets. So I don't know that I agree with Richard, but it's another way to think about it is, what is the purpose of the select committee? Is it to sort of hear tens of thousands of submissions from people? Or is it to hear a relatively representative sample and then have the time to actually do that deliberative redrafting and amendment work?
And to, in theory, in the usual course of things, there are other opportunities to submit on proposals as well. There will be discussion documents that go out before legislation is drafted. Sometimes you even, see a bit of a draft bill before you can weigh in on that, and then a law will pass, and then there's regulations that also need to be consulted on that come out of that. So there are other opportunities in the normal course of things. With the fast-track bill and the way it was, introduced under urgency and done so quickly after the election, that hasn't quite eventuated.
It's worth noting as well that your written submissions, if you've made a written submission, that will go to the select committee, that will go to all the MPs. Yes, you can't guarantee that they're going to pay as much attention to it as they will when you're speaking in front of them. But it's not as if you're being cut out of the process altogether. It still goes there. So, in that sense, democracy or representative democracy is preserved because everything that is submitted is going to go to them.
Yeah, and sitting in on many, many select committees over the years, it's interesting to watch how those hearings play out. A lot of the time, if someone has said all that they need to say in their submission, like you said, Sam, it's clear the point they're trying to make. It might be a similar point or an identical point even to many other people, and they understand that from the submission. That's fine. They kind of file it and, as read and move on. Those hearings are used to kind of tease out extra things when the committee's unsure of something, when they need expert opinion on something, someone who might be working in a specific sector or something like that, where the committee wants to ask those extra questions, understand what it's like working with those people, for example, on the ground. So that's a lot of those hearings are about question and answer. It's not just about someone kind of reading out their submission orally. So it's about the value that those hearings bring as well, I guess.
I guess one last thing that I want to leave us with the thought of, which there's not an easy answer for, but with technology, it'll throw up some thorny questions for select committees going forward, even with the self-identification bill, which allowed people to change their sex on their birth certificate. There were a significant number of submissions for that one, but a lot of them were from the United Kingdom rather than from people in New Zealand. And so you've got that, then you've got AI, potentially writing quite convincing submissions on behalf of people who don't exist. How are committees going to be able to deal with some of that coordinated inauthentic or less authentic behavior is the sort of technical term. I don't think it's something that's fully come to reality quite yet, but it's something to kind of be aware of because it probably will play a role in how the politics works going forward.
Let's wrap things up with some recommendations, something you watched, read, or listened to this week that you enjoyed. Sam.
Now, I promise this isn't just because I'm trying to get invited back on the podcast, Laura, but I am going to recommend a piece of yours from this week. Mega Prison's missing business case. This was obviously about the announcement last week around Waikeria. A lot of coverage at the time around Mark Mitchell fumbling the numbers, and, I think it was legitimate to focus on that, but I thought it was really good what you did getting beneath the surface and looking at, what evidence do we actually have here that sits behind this announcement in terms of prison population projections, the case for actually putting more money into this, and the answer seemed to be not that much. So I think it was really good to draw attention to that.
Thank you, Sam. And I'm going to do a similar thing here with Marc, 2 newsroom pieces in 1 week. I'm going to recommend Marc's piece on diplomats prioritising sovereignty over stopping another pandemic, a piece he wrote about pandemic treaty negotiations this week. Obviously, Marc has been following the topic of pandemics very closely for a while now, so I would suggest that everyone go and give that a read. What's your recommendation, Marc?
Not maybe as light reading, but a great investigative piece from CNN titled Israeli Whistleblowers Detail Abuse of Palestinians in Shadowy Detention Center. It's sort of important journalism and kind of harkens back to a time where there was a similar situation in Iraq with the Abu Ghraib detention center that kind of shocked the world, and maybe some reflections on why we're not as shocked now. Worth a read.
That's it from Raw Politics this week. Thank you to our producer, Hugo Stewart, and our readers, listeners and viewers. Please send any burning questions you have to laura.walters@newsroom.co.nz. You can find us next week here on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts.